Hi everyone. This is gonna be a bonus episode out of like who knows how many bonus episodes that we'll have of our podcast Culture Shock. Again, I'm Kwa, one half of the Culture Chair team, and this is my co-chair Kylie. And so we've gotten some messages, comments, and questions that we don't want to really incorporate in our regular topic podcast because we feel like it might take away from the overall experience. So we're just gonna address them here because we feel like they're really important questions. And this is just like a fun, relaxing episode where we just talk about like just answering these questions and just like overall general things that we want to talk about. So one of the fun questions would be when and how does that show happen every year? And so I'll let my co-chair start, and then I'll eventually add in my own thoughts and opinions about it.
Yeah, so as we talked about in an earlier episode, the date of Tet moves around a little bit. Tet Show, because the date of Tet is usually too close to the start of winter break to actually have on the day of, usually it's held sometime in March. As to how it happens, the answer to that is Tet Show magic, but also crying.
So one thing that we wanted to emphasize is that how does that show happen? So that show, how we're going to describe our own thoughts and opinions on this because obviously every other culture chair lineage before us has done something typically different. We are in a very special case to where our That Show is virtual due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Um, and so we started planning ever since we've technically been sitting in these chairs and not these wooden chairs that we're sitting on, the real, like the culture chairs. So we were elected around March of last year, and we've been working throughout April and May of last year for that show. And the real start of it was during the summer when Kylie started writing our skit. And so I ended up helping in terms of stage managing wise and figuring out props and emotions behind like each line and stuff like that. And so that's where our themes started happening. We talked about what we wanted to do as a story. And in our house that show or our intro video, we talked about that show we wanted to do a more serious and informative narrative versus like a fun folk tale that's already existing, or like an adapted one. We just wrote our completely original story. And so that show happens not just based off of magic. I think a lot of times people say like, "Oh, there's that show magic, that show magic," but without hard work, there is no magic, right? Because the magic behind it is that by the start of that show day, like everything eventually gathers itself together. Obviously, doing this virtually has not been easy on us and even our participants. But we've learned to really walk around it because again, like you really when you sit in this chair as culture, you really have to learn to think out of the box. You can't afford to really think traditionally because especially when you're stuck online, do you think dancing on Zoom is applicable or is it favorable for people, or do you think doing skit would be too like rigid? Things like that all have to be put into consideration. Even as fashion head myself, doing fashion show online is really tricky because are people going to walk in different paces? Are people going to dress up the way that you want them to? Things like that are very much a structural issue. And so hopefully through the virtual experience, me and my coach can bring you something that's a little bit more free flowing and a little bit more fun. Except for our podcast, which we try to make it as fun as possible. But again, we do want to emphasize very important topics that are connecting us and our Asian and Vietnamese community out there. So that's how we would answer when and how that show happens.
Yeah, one thing I want to kind of put in is we make this process seem very linear and easy, and it's not. To sort of take you behind the scenes, this is this was our third or fourth Tet Show idea.
Yes.
It just in terms of what the skit was going to be about. In terms of actually planning Tet Show, I mean, I don't even think we can isolate how many ideas we've gone through at this point. Yeah, so just sort of give you guys a peek behind the scenes.
Yeah. And last but not least is that like we are trying to be as transparent as possible. So like it looks different on the outside because everything is polished and everything is finalized by then. But you just have to remember that like we had to push back our dance and our interest forms almost 3 weeks later than what we had hoped. And rehearsals just started like the day of today when we're filming these podcasts. And you know, we'll be transparent, just say this. Yes, we are filming this podcast in one day. That's why the background looks the same and why everything is set up the same.
It's
But
not like I would get a different apartment.
yeah,
It's always gonna
but
look the
the
same.
reason why we're also doing that is that way we're not exposed to each other often. Like we're not seeing each other often due to the COVID-19 regulations. And to emphasize another point is that like just remember that if you do elect to be in this chair, just remember that it is both a responsibility, but it should also be something that you hopefully will take away with a little bit of fun. It's a lot of stress and a lot of work, but at the same time, I think that there is a very important, rewarding aspect of this. So that's something to keep in mind if you're running for culture. Second question would be, what are your experiences with going to older people's house for that? So I'll quickly, briefly talk about my experiences with that as a whole. But ever since I was younger, you always go to your grandparents' house, or typically they live in the same household as you are, anyways. So you go and you wish them, longevity, good health, and abundance. And then you get the red envelope with money. Now, here's the one other thing that we didn't mention on our previous one, which why we're putting in the bonus episode. Do not open your money in front of older people or if the people that give you the money. It's so disrespectful. Wait for it later. Don't try to count it. You're not, you're not a stripper in the club. Like, don't count your dollar ones and all this other stuff. It also shows that like you care more about the money than the wishes that they're providing for you as well as you're providing for them. So it's something lighthearted to think about is that like when it comes to that and going to see your elders, it's very much a tradition and it's very much something that's super important. So try to follow it the best as you can, and hopefully like your parents have told you like things like how to wish people thingies like that, and also traditions and customs like not counting your money in front of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just like generally a good practice when someone
Right.
gives you money, not to count it in front of them. To sort of talk about my own experience, obviously, my grandmother didn't celebrate that. She knew what it was, but she didn't obviously go lead the celebration for it, like Claude's grandparents did. But one thing I got to do when I was in elementary school, like through elementary school, is my school has been kind enough to let me always have my mom come in, and we would talk about Tet. So I would wear, my aoyai, because that's back when I still fit into my own aoyais. And I would talk about Tet, and I would show some of the different like ornaments and like
Right.
thingies that we had from Vietnam. And that was just a really great experience for me, sort of being able to, it's my first culture chair experience.
So another fun thing that I think we should talk about is, learning Viet. And, just learning the languages in total. So I have a roommate who is a Viet-American, and by living with me for 2 years now, I'm a second year at the university, for context, have really wanted to learn Vietnamese as a whole, just to get to know my culture as well as just like, sometimes like it's easier just to say things in Viet than it is in English. And so got him a book, and then he started learning it, and it's been a very like thought-provoking experience because not only is he able to learn about my culture, but I'm also sometimes you kind of lost a little bit of your Vietnamese language from time to time. Even though I was raised and born in Vietnam, moving here, obviously, I started to learn English, and my grammar's still terrible. But learning Viet is something that I still take pride in terms of maybe words that I didn't know when I grew up in Vietnam, or just like more cultural and traditional things that I want to learn about. So I think that's something that would be interesting for us to talk about in terms of like, hey, you want to learn Viet, or if you just want to know words in Viet that you are it's been on your mind for days, for months, for years, or whatever, let us know. Send us in, and we'll try to help you translate whatever it is that we have out there. So yeah.
Yeah, so my primary language is English, obviously growing up here. Viet is a hard language to learn. Vietnamese is very difficult if you only speak English. Just to the Western ear, it can be really hard. So we definitely don't want to. We definitely want to emphasize that, like, language learning is a whole journey. It's a whole very difficult journey, and there's not necessarily you know as many resources for learning Vietnamese out there as there are for some other languages with more speakers. One thing that sort of surprised me, I sort of assumed, this sounds stupid, but I sort of assumed when I came to college, I sort of assumed that everybody who was Viet spoke Vietnamese, which sounds like dumb, but like, I don't know, I guess I assumed because if your parents spoke it, then they would speak it to you, but that's not really the case, especially in the Vietnamese community. There are a lot of people who can, they can understand their parents, but they can't necessarily respond to them, or they can talk to people, but they can't write. And I think sort of acknowledging that the degree of language learning and fluency in our community is pretty wide will comfort a lot more people, because most people I've talked to who are in these different camps, even though it's common, everybody feels some sort of shame about it.
Right.
It's like it's not shameful not to know your own language. That's not necessarily your fault.
And if you need resources, I can recommend you two things. Duolingo is always a good way to start, at least on your Vietnamese journey. And also, if you go on places like Amazon or just places in general that sells books, try to see if they sell an elementary or intermediate Vietnamese book. I think books are a little bit more accurate in terms of like the grammar and like the aspects of it. And you would also get like fun things like Vietnamese dictionaries or like things like that to just get familiar with words. But to emphasize the fact that Vietnamese language as a whole is very different depending on dialects and depending on the area that you come from. So coming from the South, I speak a lot of Southern Vietnamese slang, and I speak a lot of slang in general when I do speak Vietnamese. So it is very different for somebody who's either in the middle part regions near Hue, which is more of like the Minh Dung area is what we would call it in Vietnam. And then you also had kind of like the rural or ethnic areas with their own very much specific language. So Miss Vietnam, about I believe 2 to 3 years ago, she was her name is Ye, and she is from a very ethnic and indigenous part of Vietnam, and they speak a very particular language that is become a little bit lost throughout the years, but her goal was to continue to educate the people and the children of that community to keep on the tradition of like things like storytelling. And you have the Northern Vietnamese dialect. Northern Vietnamese is usually the default in terms of grammar because it's a little bit more formal. As I said before, Southern Vietnamese is a little bit more slang usage, and it's very informal. So we hope that whatever dialect you come from, hopefully you have gotten some tips from your parents. But if you just wanted to learn basic grammar and basic Viet, Duolingo, or one of those workbooks will be fine. And you also have culture chairs here to help you out if you're ever interested in learning about Viet. And we also have wonderful members. One of our members in service also speaks really good Viet. And so always reach out to us if you need help. Okay, on to a more serious topic / questions. So we are now going to move on to the idea of generational gaps and impact. So the question was, what are our thoughts about the differences between the experience and lifestyles between the current and the previous generation of Asian Americans and Asians as a whole? And how does stigma come into play with the older generation? So you want to pick up on that first.
Yeah, sure. Wow, I sounded so unexcited. I didn't do that. Yeah, sure. So, obviously my older generation was white, or at least just not Vietnamese. So for me, my experience might be a little different. I think one way it sort of plays into it for me is, there are very noticeable cultural different. Like, there are very noticeable differences between the older and the younger generation. The ones that are written down and sort of presented more are that of the older generation. So I can study things in books and sort of take that route, but then I'm like I'm like a grandma, because culture changes a lot quicker than it can be recorded typically. So sort of being able to come to college and being exposed to sort of the new wave of Vietnamese American culture is really interesting for me. And the internet has helped so much with that because people can sort of put things on a lot faster and they can say, these are like the hacks and shortcuts that I use. This is sort of the way we do things now, and this is not like the way that's necessarily written down in like the official sources.
Yeah. So instead of talking about more of a general experience, I'll be talking more a little bit about what I've known from taking my sociology class. So I'm a second year, so I'm hoping to major in biology and sociology because I find it very interesting in ways that the world is very much a construct. Race, gender, things like that are very much social constructs. And so there's a term that we use called social position, in which is the place of the person in a given society, time, place, or culture. So what does that mean, right? So that means that for an older generation, Asian American or Asian, their status, social economical, um, marriage, things like that have completely changed. Same things with what we consider as a hierarchy. So older generations have gone through things like war. So therefore, their priorities is going to be leaning towards traditions, keeping traditions alive, and survival. They are not thinking about what TikTok should I go on next? What TikTok dance should I dance next? It's not like that's what their generation was about. Knowing from my own family history, things like was there enough food on the table for everybody? Was the war going to halt things like education and stuff like that? So, growing up with more older and more conservative parental figures in general, you kind of learn that they keep things very much strict and very to say the least uptight because they've known what it's like to lose, to lose things. So they want to be able to keep things the same way because adapting and moving to a different country like America can be super hard in terms of like trying to live a life again because they've already had to learn a life of post-war. So now they have to learn a life of post-war, but in a completely different country with racial and language barriers, which is really tough. And so with the younger generations, what we've noticed is that there's more of a change in what we want. So what we want is rights. And not to say that older people didn't want rights, but first they thought about we want life first, like we want to survive first. Then we think about fighting for rights. And so in America, we are now currently fighting things like climate change, anti-racism, equality for all, no matter what backgrounds they come from. And so I feel like we've had a lot of movement, we've had a lot of progress, still a lot more progress to go, but we've had the opportunity to sit there and think about what we want to fight for. Obviously, they didn't really necessarily have a chance because they've grown up in a completely different social climate. And so this will lead into our next question is why is mental health not necessarily addressed in the Asian American community? And why is that stigmatized, especially in the older generation? So in terms of stigma within specifically the older generations, is because, as we've said previously, they've had other things to worry about. They were worried about whether they were going to survive or if they had food in their tables versus, oh, am I sad? Because the whole idea of depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses or mental disorders out there is that it is kind of shoved to the side and not prioritized in the Asian American community because we've always had to think about other things first. And so the idea of always putting other things as a priority has led to big issues with why mental health is low on our priority list. And should it be the highest thing in the world? Maybe, depending on the person, right? Because we're here to customize your own personal experience. Everything is valid. But there's also the idea of the language barriers. A lot of mental health providers in the United States of America are only provided for English speakers and maybe even Spanish speakers, because Spanish is also a commonly language spoken here in the United States. But when it comes to Asian languages, we've seen maybe, and we say really maybe, provide Mandarin as a language, and um, but many other Asian countries we don't really see, and either other countries in general we don't really see translators and all the other stuff for mental health. And because the older generation, that's not something that they commonly get talked about. They might not be educated enough to help out their children, like our generation, out. So I think it is important for our generation to kind of not necessarily reach out to our parents all the time, just because they might not know what we're going through. And so I would say reach out to a mental health care provider if you're feeling any type of way about your mental health. At UVA specifically, we have a program called CAPS. And if CAPS does not work for you, there's also psychologists, therapists, whatever you need recommendation for, you can go to your own physician and ask for help. There's also a lot of hotlines that you can call, and they can direct you to the right place. Obviously, try to keep yourself in a very healthy mental health state, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that isolation and quarantine can be a little bit exhausting, to say the very least, but we want you guys to, keep a healthy mindset. And if you need anything, please reach out to your healthcare providers and mental health care providers as much as you can.
Yeah, I think I've collected my thoughts now. So I think young Asian Americans are under a lot of pressure. Whether that is from your family, that is from your community, that is from society as a whole that expects you to just be, succeeding at such a high level consistently from a young age, that like the expectations on really all young people, but especially I think on Asian Americans, are just so high.
Right.
And if you don't meet those expectations, it feels like a personal failure. I think, at least for me, I tended to very much internalize those things. I felt like very ashamed. I felt like things were my fault when I was not performing at the level I thought people expected me to, or the level that I expected myself to perform at. And some of these things stem back to things like the model minority myth, which we have discussed in a previous episode, where it's just sort of assumed that we will do well. And if you don't do well, then you're a failure. And if you have, all of your worries and concerns, you don't have time for worries and concerns when you're focused on doing well. And if you're not meeting those expectations, if you're not, getting into Stanford and having a 4.0, just the expectations on the community are just so high, which is why I think we see such high rates of mental illness and suicidal ideation and behaviors like that in the community when they are reported. Often they aren't reported until it's too late. Another thing Paul brought up was sort of how difficult it is to find healthcare providers, specifically mental health care providers who are, who have knowledge of different languages. But just sort of, I think in general, the healthcare system is overwhelmingly white. So I've been lucky to have access to a lot of good healthcare, but many of my providers, especially in the mental health field, have been white. So sort of trying to navigate things, there's almost like an additional barrier where I have to sort of, I know that, I'll have to explain, my Asian American experience when I'm just trying to get help for what's going on in my head. And it's like, I understand why they're not culturally sensitive to it. They just don't know. But it just provides an extra barrier for, achieving help when you sort of have to go back and explain what it's like to be a person of color on top of what it's like to be a person who needs help. Yeah.
And then the last thing that we wanted to expand on is we haven't talked about the model minority myth necessarily in a more detailed aspect, but according to a journal article called The Ecology of Strengths and Stress, by a group of these three authors, Shia, Do, and Chie. They have three specific myths that they want to talk about. Asian American students are model students. Asian Americans typically earn more than other ethnic groups, and immigration for Asian Americans typically are smooth. And so they did a study into which they figured out what are exactly the 14, like out of these 14 stressors, not the three I just mentioned was myths, but there are 14 types of stressors that are upon the Asian American community. And I think that their study specifically talked about a group of Cambodian immigrants as a part of their sample, and 77% of the sample said that language barrier and racial barriers are a big stressor. So that hits at number one. And number two is the 63% feel like leaving their family behind. So that idea of guilt and stuff like that kind of, hinder them from progressing necessarily in society, because they feel like if they're progressing and their family is not, then they feel like they are not doing their jobs and keeping their family in the same pathway as they are.
Yeah.
And
guilt is, I think, huge in our community, even if it's not specifically expressed. I can't speak for the children of immigrants.
Right.
Like, obviously, you'd have to address more on this. But for me, having had the opportunity to come here from a very young age and grow up with a lot of privilege and a lot of opportunities that I would not have had in Vietnam, sometimes I feel like if I'm not performing to my best level, then it's just a waste. It's like, someone else could have done this better. It's like, I have this amazing opportunity. And I think it's probably similar for children of immigrants. Your parents work so hard to bring you here and such and such and such. And it's just like, I need to perform at the highest level possible, or these sacrifices mean nothing.
Yeah. And I think on a last concluding note, remember that your elders and your parents are very much valued in Asian American society, but we do live in a progressive environment and we do live in a different modern society. So one thing that at least I can say is that don't think that just because you're their children that you can't express your opinions, because you have to kind of unstigmatize the idea of talking back to people and really make sure that you are heard as a human being, especially as an adult. You are still their children, but you are a whole human adult. So you have your own opinions and you have your own rights. So it is okay to express opinions that are opposite. I feel like a lot of times Asian Americans and Asian children tend to have that fear of like talking about their parents, being called disrespectful, things like that. But I think it's more towards that. If you don't express yourself, you kind of hinder yourself from progressing, and also it will hurt you towards the end, because the more you hold up in there, the more it could lead to things like depression and anxiety. And obviously those two things are not necessarily correlation or causation towards each other. But things like that, you keep bottling things up, it will lead to other forms of maladaptive behaviors. And so you'd rather just express yourself and get yourself heard. And, we hope that you enjoyed this bonus episode and that, it's really provided you with some clarity about our podcast as well as the topics that we are talking about. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on a real episode of Culture Shock.
Yay! Can I say one thing that I forgot to
Yeah.
say? Yeah, I think Paul talked a lot about talking back, but I don't think it's talking back. I think, and maybe this is just because I was raised American, but I see that more as speaking up, which is something we really need from the Asian community, especially the young Asian community. I've met some very powerful people and very powerful voices, but we just aren't active in the way that some other communities are. And if we were, we'd be such a powerful force. It's not like this is a small community, but it's such a strong one. And I think if people spoke up, it would benefit all of us. So speak up. Hell yeah. We're supposed to do the camera.
Yeah. You have to stop the recording.
Okay.
And before I go, I just want to say it matters not what you've done, but what you do with what you've done for others. Thank you.